So without further ado, we're going to introduce our next speaker. Dr. Erin Haramoto is an associate professor at the University of Kentucky. She received her PhD in agriculture from Michigan State University. She works extensively with cover crops, and she is the chair of the Southern Cover Crops Council. So, and she'll be talking about that subject today here for us. So thank you so much for accepting our invitation, and it's a pleasure to have you here. We will do the same protocol. People can make questions and along the presentation, and we'll try to answer at the end. All right.
Sounds good. And I've tried to blur my background, but my very distracting cat has decided to join us. She figured she would show up as this starts. I am at home.
No problem.
Well, I'm very pleased to be here this evening or whatever time it is where you happen to be watching this to talk about cover crops for weed management. I am at the University of Kentucky. I've been here for 7 years now. I have a research and teaching appointment. So I also teach classes in integrated weed management, agroecology, and also a new course called cover crops and agroecosystems. So I talk about this stuff a fair bit. My research in Kentucky focuses mostly on weed biology and ecology and management. And I work primarily in agronomic crops. For us, that means corn and soybeans primarily in this state. And I do a lot of research with cover crops, and I research mostly how cover crops interact with weeds and our cash crops too, and then how those interactions are mediated by the weather and soil conditions in particular. So it's a good example of what Dr. Diane was referring to as this more systems research. It doesn't always have a clean answer, much more complex than just changing one thing and expecting to see changing A and expecting to see result B. But it's interesting to me still, which is good. If you're not familiar with Kentucky, let's see here. I've put a little map on here with the star, that's Kentucky. So we're latitude 38 degrees north about, and then the longitude or west 84. We have an average temperature yearly of about 12.7 degrees Celsius, and we get about 1,000 millimeters of rain each year. Our rainfall tends to be very evenly distributed throughout the year, but it is we get heavy storms sometimes. So we might get, 3 inches, 4 inches, so like 10 centimeters in one storm event. So just kind of keep these in mind as we go through today's talk. Our weather is fairly typical for the Eastern United States, but maybe different than where you are located. In Kentucky, we grow a lot of corn and soybeans. We also raise a lot of animals, cattle in particular, and chickens. So we have a fair bit of pasture as well. And our agronomic crop production, those corn and soybeans, is almost all no-till. So if I forget to introduce that fact, those are mostly the systems that I work in. So for today's talk, I thought I'd give a very, very, very brief introduction to cover crops, just to make sure we're on the same page about what these are, go through some of the goals of using cover crops for weed suppression, and then get into some mechanisms on how it is that they suppress weeds. If I'm not talking for too long, I'd like to go through an example of how we use cover crops to manage this species, Canyza canadensis, which many of you I'm sure know. It's a very problematic weed for us. And then at the end, just touch briefly on how we might optimize the use of cover crops for weed suppression. Not knowing everybody's background here, I'm trying to, this is somewhat basic, so I hope that those of you that know more about cover crops can still get something out of this. And if you have comments, I would definitely welcome them at the end in the chat. So what are cover crops? Well, at least in the United States, we've always considered these to be plants that we're growing outside of our cash crop windows. And I put that window in there in quotation marks, but basically when we don't have our cash crops in the field, we might be growing these cover crops. And so their role is really maybe to fill empty niches in the field or niches. So they're using resources so that weeds can't use them, for one. Then also maybe so they're not lost to the environment, like in the case of soil nitrate, for example. So the traditional model for us, at least, is to grow, again, we're growing these plants in fields at the times we don't have a cash crop in the field. We're going to kill them before we plant that cash crop, but we're not going to harvest any of that cover crop material. It's all going to remain in the agroecosystem that's in that field. So a really common model for us in Kentucky and other parts of the US where we have a corn soybean rotation is that we're filling a temporal niche. If we have summer cash crops, that temporal niche might be over the winter. So we might plant a cool season cover crop after we harvest corn or soybeans in the fall. It grows over the winter and into the following spring. We kill it in some way, usually in our agronomic systems using herbicides, and then we plant our cash crop into that material. So this photo at the bottom here is showing this in a no-till system, and kind of outlined by this red shape is all, you can see a whole bunch of residue remaining in the field after we planted our cash crop, which is visible somewhat in these rows here. So not all of our cash crops, though, are grown in the summer. So we can have empty niches or empty windows too in our warm seasons. So we have warm season or summer cover crops that can be commonly used as well. And so these might be more common in our vegetable cropping systems, for example. So very briefly, we do have some other models of using cover crops too. So you might see things like intercrops, planted where we have a cover crop growing between rows of cash crops. So they're in the field at the same time, but they're spatially separated. Living mulches that might be occurring maybe between raised beds and vegetable production are often also considered to be cover crops. And at least in the United States, some of our definitions now allow for grazing or removing cover crop material for hay. Some of our producers might be getting financial incentives from different government agencies. And so this is where definitions can start to vary. So if they are getting financial incentives, they need to be double checking or verifying with the government agency what it is that they can do with that material. Clearly, if they can graze it or cut it for hay, it might alter its weed suppressive benefits, but it's also providing them with an additional revenue stream that might further encourage them to use these cover crops. So moving into the second part here in terms of goals, what we might want to get out of these cover crops for weed suppression. I want to just kind of start this by saying what one of our goals shouldn't be. And I think that we should not count on cover crops to completely eradicate weeds. If you go into a cropping system with that as your goal of using cover crops, you're likely to be disappointed. Cover crops are not going to result in 100% control of weeds. But I would argue that the goal of using these in our systems is to reduce weed density, slow the emergence of weeds, and decrease the growth of weeds that do successfully emerge. So what is this doing for us? Well, it helps to improve the efficacy of other weed management tactics that we might be using, including herbicides. We can also be lengthening the windows that might be available for these tactics. So if you think about a post-emergence herbicide that's supposed to be applied when weeds are between 10 and 15 centimeters tall, if we're delaying the emergence of those weeds and slowing their growth, then we have a longer window in which those can be effective. And really what both of these do is kind of help us to both slow the evolution of herbicide resistance and deal with it a little bit better when it does occur in fields. And lastly, these goals, including decreasing the growth of weeds, can reduce their competitive ability against our crops, which is a big advantage for us. So these are the things I'm going to focus on today, but do note that there are some longer term impacts of using cover crops for weed management. So they can be contributing to the management of seeds in the soil seed bank, maybe increasing seed predation and decay, which can result in having fewer weeds in the soil. And then they can also be contributing some rotational diversity, so stressing weeds in different ways than our normal crop rotations might do. And so just to touch on this point again about not using cover crops as a substitute for herbicides, but rather in our herbicide-based systems, thinking about cover crops as complementary to these herbicides. So something that we can use to make them more effective. One of the questions we get quite frequently is asking, if I use cover crops, does that mean that I can eliminate an herbicide application? And that's a really difficult question for us to answer. As you can imagine, it depends on a lot of different factors, including the specific weed seed bank in that field, perhaps, what the weather conditions might be like in any given year. So what we kind of try to encourage growers to do is to be really flexible with this and to try to take some time to learn what might be possible in a given system. So it is fairly unlikely that at least in the beginning, we can guarantee that, yes, you can eliminate an herbicide application. But this is still a question that we get quite frequently. And I would argue maybe, again, it's not quite the right question to ask. Maybe instead, we want to be asking, if I use cover crops to help manage my weeds, does that mean, will that help me increase the efficacy each time I apply an herbicide? Is it going to lower the chances that I need to go in and respray because I sprayed weeds when they were too big, for example, or some of them escaped my application? Is it going to be helping me reduce the long-term risks of herbicide resistance in my field? Am I going to be reducing seed production from my weeds? Am I going to be lowering the competitive ability of these weeds against my crops? I would argue that these types of questions are maybe what we want to be encouraging growers to think about as they learn how to use cover crops in their systems for weed suppression. So as I mentioned earlier, Kentucky, we grow a lot of summer annual cash crops, and our cover crops fit in the winter between those. So that's going to be kind of the system I'm going to focus on today. We're also a very heavy no-till state. So we do not use a lot of tillage in these cropping systems. So most of the research I'm going to show you from my own research is going to be the role of cover crop residues after we plant. So this is the cover crop while it's growing. Then we've sprayed it off, planted soybeans into it, and all of that material then is forming this mulch layer between the soybean rows. So we're going to go through some specifics of that system, but really, again, we're hoping to achieve those same goals, regardless of whether cover crops are growing over the winter or over the summer, regardless of whether we're leaving all that residue sitting on the soil surface, forming a mulch, or if we're tilling it into the soil. So the details are going to differ, but really the principles are the same, and we hope to be achieving the same goals. And before we get into these mechanisms then, I just want to have one last push here for cover crops is just one tool in our integrated weed management toolbox, we call this. So we know that there are all of these different things that we can be doing in our cropping systems to stress weeds. Some of these are more preventative or proactive, so trying to keep weeds from becoming a problem in the first place. And some of them are more reactive. So we're dealing with weeds once they have emerged. And some of these are going to be more feasible than others in different cropping systems. But there are a lot of things that we want to consider for these integrated weed management programs that are targeted towards preventing resistance or dealing with resistance once it shows up. So using the more of these tactics that we can use, the lower the chance that weeds are going to adapt to any given tactic, like by evolving herbicide resistance, or that communities are going to shift towards dominance by species that are harder to control. So again, remember cover crops, just one tool in our toolbox here. So moving on, I'd like to get into the meat of this talk today then, which is on these mechanisms of how it is that cover crops actually suppress weeds. And so remember, by suppression, we're talking about reducing emergence, so decreasing the density of weeds, delaying that emergence, and then also reducing the growth of weeds that do successfully emerge, so resulting in smaller individuals. And so we're going to start by going through some of these mechanisms that are occurring while cover crops are growing in our fields. Again, so generally when we don't have a cash crop in the field, and then we're going to move to talk about them after termination. So what happens to all that residue after we've killed that cover crop? And we'll touch on both tilled and no-till systems for the residue effects. Okay, so a lot of these impacts of cover crops on weeds are occurring through the soil environment. So plants change the soil as they grow. Soils also influence plants as they grow as well. And so these cover crops can have really dramatic changes to the soil environment that can then influence weeds. So some of these changes, so this is a little diagram over here on the right that we're going to go through. And so here's our growing cover crop. You see a couple of weeds in there as well. And then these little black circles represent seeds in the soil. Sorry, I think I'm on the wrong. Okay. Cover crop plants, a few weeds that have successfully emerged, and weed seeds in the soil. So some of the changes to the soil environment that occur as these cover crops are growing. Well, growing plants are going to intercept light. So less light is going to reach the soil surface. So if we have weed seeds at the soil surface or just under the soil surface that need a fair bit of light as a cue for germination, their germination might be suppressed. And as we'll see, this is particularly a cue that some of our smaller seeded weeds often need. So cover crop material contains chlorophyll. Chlorophyll absorbs red light. So if light passing through these canopies of cover crops tends to get or is depleted also in red light wavelengths. So again, some of our weed seeds need a relatively higher ratio of that red light to be able to germinate effectively. So if the red light is depleted, it's a sign to them that there are potential competitors growing above them and that they don't want to germinate at that time. So cover crops can influence both the amount of light and what we call the light quality or the spectrum of light that reaches the soil. So because these cover crops, again, are intercepting light, they're also lowering soil temperature while they're growing. And not only are they lowering temperature, but generally we have fewer extreme temperatures and lower fluctuations, maybe between day and night temperatures, for example. So seeds, a lot of species have a base temperature below which they will not germinate. Again, a lot of our small seeded weed species germinate better when they have fluctuations in temperature. It's a sign that they're closer to the soil surface and more likely to successfully emerge. So if we're decreasing those fluctuations, lowering the temperature, we might be decreasing the number of seeds that can successfully germinate. So cover crops can have variable impacts on soil moisture. While the plants are actively growing, they can be transpiring and drawing down or reducing soil moisture, but then they're also lowering the evaporation potential, again, by intercepting more incoming solar radiation. So the net effect of cover crops while they're growing on soil moisture might depend on how much rainfall we're getting, how sunny it is outside, how quickly those cover crops are growing. So it can be a little hard to predict. Same goes for soil nitrogen. If we're growing a legume cover crop that fixes nitrogen, we might actually have higher amounts of nitrogen in the soil. But if we're growing something like a grass or a small grain, it might be taking up nitrogen and lowering the amount that's available in the soil. So harder to predict. There's also the potential for allelopathy, and this is going to also be species dependent. Some cover crop species are well known to be allelopathic, like cereal rye and some of our mustards, and other ones are not quite so allelopathic. So again, something that's species specific. And so to make the, just to point out first too, this can be cover crops actively growing over the winter or over the summer. So as long as there's actively growing plants in the field, we think that these mechanisms should be occurring. But as you can see, again, this is a very complex system. Lots of interactions, not just between plants and soil and the weather, but also microbes in the soil, insects that might be eating the plants, weather conditions in any given year. So it can be really hard to predict like the net effect of all of these things. But I'm going to try to do that. So if we have seeds that are in the soil or on the soil, again, the net result usually of having these plants growing is that fewer of those seeds are going to germinate, and their germination may be delayed, particularly in response to temperature. So once those seedlings do successfully germinate, any emerged seedlings have there are a couple of ways that they're going to be affected. So these cover crop plants are going to be competing with those emerged weed seedlings. Now, some of our cover crops are going to be more competitive than others, and we'll go through a couple examples of these. In addition, any delay in seedling emergence that we can have is going to give an additional competitive advantage to our cover crops. There's all sorts of things that come into play here related to seed size as well that can mean that that can make those cover crop plants more competitive than weeds and generally kind of win that at that competitive outcome. But these are the types of things that we expect to occur as we have cover crops growing in the field. Okay, so there is just two photos here to show the effect of having of different plant species, and again, those changes to the soil environment. So a lot of the impacts on weeds that we expect are going to be mediated through changes basically in solar radiation that reaches the soil, whether that's light, whether that's the amount of light, the spectrum of the light, the temperature. So you can see that cover crop plants like the photo on the right here, which is a cereal rye cover crop that cover more of the ground, are going to be more effective in suppressing weeds than something like a crimson clover cover crop that you see on the left here. And in fact, you see these were planted on the same day in early September, and these photos were from about 2 months after planting. And you can't see any bare soil in the cereal rye plots, but you see a lot of bare soil between these rows of crimson clover. So the more light these cover crops can intercept, the stronger these effects are more likely going to be on germination and emergence, and also on outcompeting any small emerged weeds for light. So what can be the impact of these cover crops on weed suppression, again, while they're growing? I'd just like to show you a little bit of data from one of our trials. We planted wheat and cereal rye cover crops in the fall after a corn harvest for us. And we sampled them when we terminated them in the spring, and we're getting ready to plant soybeans. And so we killed these with an herbicide application. When we sampled all the plant material, we separated it into two fractions, the cover crop fraction and the weed fraction. So, and then I plotted them up against each other. So this is cover crop biomass shown here on the X, and I realized I forgot to convert it. Pounds per acre is approximately close to kilograms per hectare. And then winter weed biomass on our y-axis. And so these are weeds that are growing in that cover crop. So ones that hopefully that cover crop is out competing. You see there's a pretty direct negative relationship here. The more cover crop biomass we generated, the lower winter weed biomass we had in those plots. Now, we didn't measure density, so we don't know if this is an effect of the cover crop actually suppressing weed emergence, so resulting in fewer weeds, or if it's an effect of that cover crop outcompeting weeds that did successfully emerge and reducing their growth. So we can kind of think of this maybe as a net effect of both of those operating together. But what's the upshot of this? Well, weeds that are there are smaller, and again, going to be easier to target with our herbicide applications. We'll see an example of this coming up when I go through that example with Coniza canadensis. Weeds that are in that field are producing fewer seeds. Winter weeds are not as problematic for us in corn soybean rotations, but we do have some species that have developed resistance that are more problematic for our growers that grow winter wheat, for example. So we really don't want those producing seeds and persisting in the seed bank. And again, fewer weeds, smaller weeds means over time, the less chance of developing herbicide resistance. So this is just a net effect then of how suppressive these cover crops can be against weeds while they are growing. So let's switch gears and talk about the second phase of our cover crop, if you will. So these cover crops, remember, are kind of filling empty windows between our cash crops. So eventually we have to kill it and plant a cash crop into that field. So if we're doing that in a no-till system, so we're not using tillage to prepare the soil for planting. Again, this is common for us in our state, in our corn and soybean production, less common in some of our specialty crops like vegetables. But if we're not using tillage, all of that cover crop material becomes a mulch layer on the soil surface. And the more cover crop biomass that we generated over that winter, the thicker that mulch layer is, eventually, that thicker that mulch layer will be. So again, a diagram. Now we've got, now we have a mulch on top of the soil surface. We have some weed seeds in here. Again, you can imagine you have a layer of residue on the soil surface. Less light is going to get down to the soil. So we're reducing light still. We tend to have lower temperature as well under these mulches. They're preventing evaporation, and now we don't have any transpiration. So generally we have higher moisture environments here, can have variable nitrogen impacts depending on what type of residue we're talking about. And then the other thing that we're adding now that we've terminated it is this physical, I've called it physical impedance, but this is just producing a barrier to seedling emergence. So now we have something on the soil surface that seedlings need to wind their way through to be able to start photosynthesizing. And I'm not going to talk about seed decay or seed predation or seedling decay that much, but do note that a lot of these conditions here, lower light, lower temperature, higher moisture, are maybe really beneficial habitat for things like seedling-borne diseases. Now, with our crop plants, we protect our seed with a fungicide seed coating so that we're hopefully not getting these things. But if you're a small weed seedling, you might be particularly susceptible to some of those pathogens. So, difference between no-till system and a tilled system is that we're going to mix all of that residue into the soil if we're using tillage. And so it can be a little bit harder to predict the net effect on light, temperature, and all of these other factors in the soil. It often depends on how the cover crop was managed before tillage. So was it mowed, for example? And then the tillage intensity. Are we just running over it maybe with one tillage pass, or are we using a moldboard plow to really invert that residue into the soil? So it can be a lot harder to predict what's going to happen in the soil. But two things that do become more important as we're incorporating residues into the soil are allelopathy. Again, this can be very species specific, and it can also be very short-lived, but we can have allelopathic effects when we incorporate those residues. The other thing we generally see with incorporated residues is that all of those chunks of material that get mixed in with the soil can decrease what we call seed soil contact. And so this is the contact between a seed and the soil that's providing moisture, for example, for that seed to imbibe to start the germination process. It's also providing a substrate for its little radicle to start penetrating to take up moisture and nutrients. So if we have really big chunks of residue and we have small weed seeds, we can often decrease the successful germination and emergence of those seeds and seedlings because they don't get in good contact with the soil. So I'm going to talk mostly about the role of mulches here. Again, this is in a no-till system. The cover crop residue is left on the soil surface, and the types of weeds that it is going to be more effective in suppressing, because not all weeds are going to be well suppressed by these mulches. But what is really well suppressed are these small seeded broadleaf weeds. They generally, again, the small seeds generally have a light requirement for germination because they have very small endosperms. They need to start photosynthesizing soon after emergence. So those light requirements requiring temperature fluctuations is a cue to them that they're closer to the soil surface and will be able to start photosynthesizing as soon as they emerge. They also tend to have very small and thin seedlings with a very weak hypocotyl. And so this photo is from Chenopodium album. And you see just how kind of we would call this spindly, but very thin seedlings. So getting their way through those barriers that the mulch layer can form, being able to withstand some allelopathy early on, they're just not as effective in getting through these mulch layers. Larger seeded broadleaf weeds, though, like the morning glories you see in the photo on the right, tend to not have a light requirement or as strong of a light requirement for germination. So they can germinate from deeper in the soil because they have more reserves in their endosperm and stronger seedlings. So not only do they don't require light, but they're also better able to wind their way through these residues. Similar for grasses, again, not as common to have a light requirement for germination. And then just the morphology of a grass seedling, the coleoptile kind of protects that seedling as it punches its way through residues. And lastly, perennials also are not as well controlled by these mulches. So the vegetative structures are providing them with resources as they emerge, and they have stronger seedlings. So if we think, again, back to the importance of using cover crops as just one tactic in managing weeds, this is a really good example of this. If you consistently had a high residue cover crop and nothing else, you might do well in controlling your small seeded broadleaf weeds, but you might see a shift in your weed community towards these other types of species that are harder to control. And I see, unlike Dr. Diane, I have too many slides and I'm talking way too slowly. So I am going to skip ahead just a little bit. If anybody's interested at the end, we can come back to this effect of weed biomass, the effect of cover crop residue amounts on weed biomass. A neat meta-analysis came out last year that shows that, yes, you can suppress weed biomass in the next crop with more residue, and that grass cover crops, and especially our small grains, are more suppressive than some of our other cover crops. I'm going to skip over, I knew I was going to have too much to talk about today. I'm going to skip over some of our research too, but the research, the results I was going to show you basically demonstrate that, yes, these residues compared to having not any residue at all are going to reduce your weed density. And the more residue you have, the lower your weed density will be. So small amounts of residue suppress weeds, but more amounts of residue suppress weeds even better. And that holds true for both density of weeds and the biomass of weeds. And if we think about our goals of reducing density and slowing their growth, that's evidence that both of those things are occurring. And both of those have benefits in terms of resistance management and reducing competitive ability with our crops. Okay, so I did want to mention this though too, the role of soil residual herbicides. So if we are in herbicide-based systems, which again, a lot of our agronomic cropping systems are still heavily reliant on herbicides, one of our best management practices now for mitigating and preventing, or I shouldn't say preventing, but maybe delaying the evolution of herbicide resistance is to use these soil residual herbicides. So what these do is they prevent weeds from emerging in the first place so that we don't need to go through and kill them after they've emerged and they're actively growing with one of our post-emergence applications. So there is still a role for these soil residual herbicides in cover crop systems. Even though I'm talking about reducing the density of weeds, there's still a clear role for these products. And so one question about these is, are they going to bind to cover crop residues? So they need to get into the soil to contact those weeds that are germinating and emerging to stop them from actually emerging. But if we spray them over the top of a thick mulch layer, are they going to get intercepted or bound to that mulch layer? Well, the short answer to that is they can, and it depends on the type of the product that's being applied and the type and the amount of residue that's present in the field. But that if they can be timed to having either rainfall or irrigation soon after application, so like within a week ideally, then the products can be washed off of the residue and into the soil where they're going to be active. And are they necessary? Well, again, the answer to that is, yeah, they're still pretty important, again, in our herbicide-based systems, especially if we already have resistance in that field. So what they provide is kind of insurance. So residue is not going to be, you're not going to have a even thick residue layer, most likely, across the whole field. Where it might get thinner you're going to have weeds emerging. And you see that highlighted in this photo, in this first circle here. You also might have that in your crop row, where you've maybe pushed some of the residue aside to establish your crop. So there might be gaps or thin spots in residue. So having these soil residual herbicides provides, again, so like an insurance policy is the way we tend to phrase it. They also are effective against the species that aren't suppressed by residues, like our large seeded broadleaves, like the morning glories you see in the upper right of the photo, and some of our grasses. And so it's important, again, to be using all of the tools that we have to be managing weeds, and these soil residual herbicides are a good tool to use still in these systems, especially systems that might not have a lot of residue in them. And so we're not really ready to recommend conditions when they can either be eliminated or delayed. And so this gets to that point of using adaptive management to really be able to think about or to learn from what's happening in farmers' fields, if this is going to be possible. Okay, I think I'm doing okay on time. So I'd like to go through this example of using how we use cover crops to suppress Canyza canadensis. Now I'm guessing most folks are going to be familiar with this genus at least. Canyza canadensis for us is known by the common names of mare's tail or horseweed. So I apologize if I slip into what I would normally call this and call it one of those species. So yes, it is related to Canyza bonariensis and sumatrensis, but it is a different species from both of those. It's a very problematic weed for us, and I'll go through one of the reasons why that is, but it's very competitive. So it can cause large high yield loss if it's not controlled well. And it's also just not well controlled by a lot of our herbicides that we use in our broadleaf crops, including soybean. So those are two reasons that it's problematic. And then the third is, of course, that it has evolved herbicide resistance in the United States and in other parts of the world too. In the United States, we've seen glyphosate resistance now for over 20 years in this species. It's pretty widespread. And we also see some different non-target site resistance mechanisms, which is worrying. So 3 reasons why this is a very problematic species for us. Now, what makes it difficult to control with the herbicides that we do have remaining is that it's what's called a facultative winter annual for us in the United States. So seeds are produced about this time of year, which for us, we're in late summer now. Those seeds can germinate and emerge during 2 windows of emergence. So we can have them emerging in the fall, soon after seeds are produced. They can also emerge early or throughout the spring. And emergence in the spring can start really early. So then they form a small rosette. That rosette just keeps growing. If you're familiar with this weed, you know how fast these can grow. It bolts and then eventually sets seed. So this is its life cycle for us. And this is what can make it really difficult, is the fact that it has 2 emergence windows. And so if you don't control this weed, again, it can start emerging in the fall. So its density increases. And again, if you're not managing it, now some of them will die over the winter, but not enough. It'll start emerging again in the spring. And so by the time we go to plant, we can have really high density of this species. So and then the ones that emerge in the fall, they have all of our winter period to grow. And winters in Kentucky, we tend to have some really warm spells. And so by the time we go to plant our soybeans, for example, plants that emerged the previous fall might be 15, 20 centimeters in diameter, starting to grow vertically already, and can be very difficult to control with one herbicide application at the time of soybean planting. So generally, we recommend that you want to spray early, catch plants when they're smaller so that they don't get so big by the time of planting. So if you have a bunch of fall emerged mare's tail, you can spray it in late fall and you kill those plants off and everything looks great until it starts to emerge again in the spring. And if you have applied this herbicide in the fall and killed off all the other weeds that are in the field, now you have basically empty soil, plenty of resources available for these weeds that are emerging in the spring. So you can get quite high densities of these weeds, again, emerging by the time you're ready to plant. Same thing goes if you kill them off in the spring. So this might be an extra application for you in the spring. You're still going to have them emerging during this whole window before planting. So what our projects have shown, again, is if you apply these herbicides in fall or early spring to target those as they're emerging, you can decrease their density, but you're not preventing all of that spring flush. And that can really be considerable if you're removing the competition. Now you could think about using a residual herbicide at this time, but that adds expense. And it can also then limit your options in your next crop. So it's not really ideal. But our research has shown, and other folks doing research on this species, that if you plant a cover crop in the fall, it can outcompete those plants that emerged in the fall, even if it's planted after. If you get a good stand of that cover crop, it grows rapidly, again, shades the soil. It can be really effective in outcompeting this mare's tail. Sorry, Canyza canadensis. And the cover crop is also effective in suppressing that spring flush of emergence. So we can have lower density by planting time. There's also, but this is, I wanted to point out this really nice study that was done in Pennsylvania, where they did a similar thing. They planted cover crops in the fall. They counted and measured the size of Canyza plants in the spring. And so the unique thing about this study is that they were measuring the size of those plants at the time they were getting ready to apply their pre-plant herbicides for a soybean crop. So what I copied these figures from this paper that appeared in Weed Science 2 years ago. So these figures showing us the size distribution of those plants at the time of soybean planting. And that corresponds to the diameter down here at the bottom. So here's the range of size, and this is just a histogram. It's also showing us the number of plants. And what they found is that when they had a cereal rye cover crop in the field, they actually had lower density. So over the 2 years they did this study, half the number of plants in the field. So goal one, reduce density. They also had a smaller average size. So if we look at our histogram, here's our average for no cover crop. Here's our average size for with a cover crop. So slowing their growth, one of our other goals. The other really key thing that they found was that there were no really large individuals at this time in their cover crop plots. Whereas without a cover crop, they had in this 1 year of the study, at least one individual that was 6 inches, so 15 centimeters in diameter. So if you kind of put all of these, especially these really large plants out here, these ones that are 10 to 15 centimeters in diameter at the time of spraying, which one of these would you rather have to kill? This one that's maybe 2 centimeters in diameter, or this one that's more like 15 centimeters? Which one is your herbicide application going to be more effective on? Which one are you more likely to have to go in and treat again? So for us, cover crops really have a clear role to play in managing this problematic species, suppressing the ones that emerge in the fall and preventing the emergence of that second flush in the spring. And if you're interested, we have information about, or we've done a little bit of study on penetration of post-emergence herbicides through these cover crop canopies while they're growing. And so I could always talk your ear off about stuff like that at a later date. But I wanted to just touch for the last maybe 5 minutes on this section. So actually optimizing cover crops for weed suppression. So what types of species would you want to use? Well, the first question I would ask any grower that asks me this question is weed suppression the only thing you want to get? So some of our more weed suppressive cover crops are going to provide services like covering the soil and lowering erosion rates, but they might not be providing you with nitrogen, for example, from a legume. So growers really need to balance what their goals are for using these cover crops. But if weed suppression is their primary goal, then it's really our small grains like cereal rye or wheat or triticale that are going to be the most effective because they produce the most biomass, they cover the ground the fastest, they produce competitive plants, and their residue is more persistent. So those are some factors that make them clear winners, I'll say, in being very suppressive against weeds. So if we're going to be growing these over our winter, so they get planted in the fall, a lot of these can get planted later in the fall and still successfully overwinter in more temperate regions. So we have some legumes too that might be good cover crops, but on their own, a lot of legumes tend to be slow to establish and produce seedlings that are not very competitive. One exception is shown on the right here. This is a plant that we call cowpea, and I forgot to look up its scientific name. This genus is Vigna, V-I-G-N-A. This is a warm season species for us though. And you can see that it is nice and competitive. 4 weeks after planting, it's completely covered the soil surface. So residue of legumes though tends to not be very persistent. So after they're terminated, they're not going to be, their residue will not be as suppressive for as long. And if we're growing winter legumes in our temperate climates, they need to be planted pretty early. Brassicas, these include things like radishes, turnips, mustards, canolas. Some of them are competitive when they establish and some of them are not. Again, for our winter, our cool season species, they also have to be planted relatively early and they can be hard to kill in the spring, especially as they start to flower. Can be difficult to manage with herbicides. I wanted to throw one last warm season cover crop in there called buckwheat. I'm not going to try to pronounce the scientific name, but there it is. So you could look it up and know what it's called in your location. This is also a very competitive plant that's easy to establish, so is often used to suppress weeds over the summer, maybe in combination with some grasses like millets or sorghum Sudan grass. And you can see it has these flowers that bring in pollinators, but it is a species that can actually become weedy because it can produce seeds soon after these flowers appear. So we would call that a volunteer cover crop. The other question I would ask somebody if they were trying to manage a cover crop to best suppress weeds is, do they want to use this really high biomass system? If they do, they need to consider lengthening out that cover crop window as much as possible. Now, of course, that needs to be managed by when are they going to fit in their cash crop around that cover crop. And then they have to consider competitive species with really persistent residue, and again, be able to manage other aspects of the system. So modify planters so that they get an even crop stand and deal with any challenges to fertility and diseases and insects, for example, that they might have. And so just to show, if they can't deal with that residue, they end up with something that looks like this. Trying to plant soybean seeds through a heavy cereal rye residue, not being very successful and getting large gaps in a soybean stand. And, you know, a crop is a competitive and even crop stand is a good, is also an important weed management tool. So can cover crops contribute to weed management? The answer to that is yes, they can. They can improve the efficacy of herbicides that we are applying, lower the risk of developing herbicide resistance. Again, if we're trying to accomplish these goals of reducing weed density, delaying emergence, suppressing the growth of weeds. But those effects are complex, always mediated through the soil, and so maybe a little bit difficult to predict. Some weeds are going to be affected more than others, and so important to consider cover crops as just one of those tools. Generally, the more biomass we have, whether the cover crops are growing or after they're terminated, is going to result in better weed suppression. And while that might be true, that increased biomass has to be balanced against other goals and also what is manageable within any given system. And lastly, again, just to reiterate, these are only one part of integrated weed management plans. So they're really just meant to complement other tactics. I put including soil residual and post-emergence herbicides, but you can think about all those other circles in that integrated weed management toolbox that could be other components of systems that don't rely as heavily on herbicides. So with that, I'm happy to take some questions that we have, and I put my contact information up here on this slide, and you can also find me through just Googling me. Okay, I think I talked for a little bit too long, but hopefully there's time for questions.
Yes, we do have time for questions, and people are staying with us, so that's a good thing. Thank you so much, Erin, for your excellent presentation. We have actually several questions here. I'll go to them as we follow here. So Felipe Soder said, great presentation. What way the cover crop actor under negative photoblastic weed seeds, since the light isolation is not a problem for its germination?
Sorry, let me pull it up so I can read it too.
Yeah.
Cover crops act under negative photoblastic weed seeds, since light isolation is not a problem for its germination. Yeah. So how do cover crops influence weed seeds that do not require light? Is that, I think that's, if I'm interpreting photoblastic, yeah. So, again, light is just, I talked a lot about light because it tends to be one of the primary ways through which cover crops can change the soil environment and mediate this. So again, through some of the other mechanisms, like changes to moisture or nitrogen, may also change the germination rates of seeds that don't require light. But even if emergence of some of those seeds is not suppressed, either the competitive effects of the cover crop or the other types of, we call them residue mediated effects, can still be suppressing those species. So yes, they might not be suppressed as much as species that have that light response, but generally still would see some suppression in most species.
Good. Do you want to pull the next one? I think it'll be almost as easier.
So yeah, my question is how cover crops would work for weed suppression in agricultural systems of the low and high tropics where there are no defined climatic seasons. That's a great question. And so in the southern region, we're on kind of the northern edge of what we would call the southern United States. So I work with a lot of folks in Florida as well, in the southern US, where in South Florida, the seasons are also not as defined. And we're also working on some cover crop selection tools for Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands, where again, seasons are not as defined as ours are. And so again, it's just kind of a matter of when are you going to grow this cover crop around your different crops that might be in the field, especially the part where, so both of these mechanisms that are in play while those plants are growing, and then also after they're suppressed, can be in play no matter when those cover crops are grown and terminated. Now, clearly the specifics are going to differ because residues might be faster if it's wetter and warmer, for example. So you might not get as long a benefit out of a residue that you might in a cooler location. But again, the mechanisms, the general mechanisms should be pretty similar. But you have all sorts of different species that you can use as cover crops too, that we can't grow in colder regions.
Okay.
So I hope that answered the question. I'll go to the next one. What is the impact of crop density per unit area, early rapid canopy formation and closure on weed seed germination and emergence, as well as crop yield? So if this question is about cover crop density per unit area, we've done just a little bit of research on that, on like cover crop seeding rates. And a lot of cover crops are relatively, the biomass produced by them is less sensitive to seeding rate than you might expect. So especially for small grains, if you plant them at a lower seeding rate, they tiller. They produce more tiller. Each plant produces more tillers. So you have fewer plants, but their biomass of the leaf material can almost be similar. So for some species, seeding rate can drop and have similar biomass production to higher seeding rates. But what some of our research has shown is that early on, soon after those are planted, the ones with higher seeding rates actually cover the ground faster than with lower seeding rates. So that tillering process just takes some time. And I think that I missed the other part of the question. Apologize. And then another question here from the plate you just showed. I think I saw a great interrow space between the soybean. How will the cover crop here reduce weed seed emergence and performance in the early crop growth stage? Supposedly pre-emergence herbicide is not used. Yes, and so we generally in the United States, in Kentucky, we grow soybeans on, I'm gonna mess this up, 19 centimeters or 38 centimeter row spacing. The photo you saw was double that, it was 76 centimeters. And I was intentionally doing that so that I could have more weeds early season. But again, if you're growing soybeans in wider rows, that having more, that residue layer where in between all of that, where the soybeans are not gonna have an influence yet, could be beneficial. And yeah, that photo that you saw did have no pre-emergence herbicides in that. So that was all of the residue, all suppression from the residue. But yeah, playing with these combinations of crop row spacing, crop planting density can also have huge influence on impacts of these residues and in general. So good question. One other question here was about, would buckwheat possibly affect its following cash crop due to allelopathy releasing in the soil? So the short answer to that is maybe. So yes, buckwheat and a bunch of our cover crops can be allelopathic. And so allelopathy is generally short-lived. The effect does not last for very long. So it would depend on what crop you were planting into that and how long you waited after killing buckwheat to plant that crop. So the longer you wait between killing the buckwheat and planting your next crop, the less chance it's going to be affected by allelopathy. And then also if you're planting something that has a larger seed, so if you're in a vegetable system, you're planting something with larger seeds or with transplants, those are generally also not as affected by allelochemicals. So they tend to be more negatively affect smaller seeded things more. If you were going to direct seed something like carrots, which have a very small seed, you would want to wait a little bit longer for those effects to for them to dissipate. But yes, it's an important consideration for anything that could be allelopathic. And we generally recommend waiting 2 or 3 weeks between killing a cover crop and planting something. Although a lot of growers are now they're doing what we call planting green in the United States and actually planting things like corn and soybeans into cover crops before they've even been killed. Those two crops have large seeds, so are again going to be less affected by allelopathy. But I would not try that with something like carrots with a small seed.
Okay, we have some questions now on the chat. I don't know if you want to pull that up or want me to read for you.
Yes, I can. All right, let me scroll up to the top here. So we evaluated differences in allelopathy or suppression behavior on different varieties of cereal rye. I have not, but there is a lot of research. There has been a lot of research done on that because cereal rye is such a popular cover crop. So there's a program right now at North Carolina State University that is actually breeding different cereal rye germplasms and evaluating their allelopathy. You know, as you can guess, some of the challenges with this is that it often can be difficult to keep getting the same varieties of seed. Especially for cover crops, it's a little, as demand kind of increases and decreases, it can be challenging for that. But yeah, some of that research is being done.
I want to make a point on that. I saw in some of your pictures the morphology of the cereal array that you show is quite different than the ones we used to see in Brazil. I don't know if it's I think one of the first pictures that you show. It's more like prostrate, and here we have plants that are more erect.
Was it this one?
Let's see. Yeah, that one on the right.
So this is
that caught my attention, that picture, because of that.
And so this cereal rye variety is called a rustic, and it is one of the older cereal rye varieties that's more adapted to cooler locations. And we have done just a little bit of work with different cereal rye varieties or cultivars. I'm not sure which it is. And if we grow warm season, so cereal rye that's adapted for the southern United States, they do grow more upright. But our cool season ones grow like this in Kentucky. So we have two varieties for the South. One is called Wren's, a bruisey, and that one will grow more upright. And yeah, I could have showed one of those pictures. So lots of differences even within cultivars of cover crops. And that's a whole nother area of research on how those are all going to suppress. So the next question, I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to answer this. So it was about, have you evaluated the efficacy differences between flumioxazin and sulfentrazone on high residue cover crops? And what would be more important in order to affect the residue crop bind, formulation or active? I have only done a little bit of work with sulfentrazone in cover crops. And again, what our research has shown, we didn't do a detailed look at how much was bound to the residue. This was just kind of net effects in the field. Did we have more weeds where we applied these compounds and had a lot of residue versus a little residue? And so the net effect of them was similar regardless of residue amount. And I don't think I can answer the second part of that. So in short, no, I haven't compared with flumioxazin. And the second part, would it be more important in order to affect the residue formulation or active? That's also a good question. Most of the research that gets done on this is varying the active, but not necessarily formulations of the active. So I don't know the answer to that one either. Sorry. And let's see. Here's another question about how to efficiently adopt cover crop strategies for weed suppression. Yeah, okay, so maybe ended up.
It was just a compliment, I think, from what you answered previously.
Yeah, so in the low and high tropics, all sorts of different species. Some of them, the theory though should stay the same. I'm not sure what the last one.
Yeah.
Accident.
I think we have taken all the questions that came up, and we cover our time. So we once again from the committee that is organizing these activities, we appreciate your time and the great presentation that you gave us. Also, we appreciate the audience of staying with us. And before we close the day, we would like to keep in mind that next week, same time, we have another presentation. Presentation will be focused on site-specific weed management. Okay, so hope you guys stay safe and have a good week, and we hope to see you next week. Thank you, Erin.
Everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.